The discussion around race in the United States has turned nasty. Build a wall, travel and immigration plans, deportations, all of these are aimed at keeping others outside of the country. And internally, tension between Black Americans and police officers continues to escalate with deadly consequences. Latinos and Muslims are subject to one verbal or legal attack after another. Then came the Charlottesville riots. The Unite the Right rally turned violent when a man rammed his car into counter-protesters, leaving one woman dead and dozens injured. And a police helicopter monitoring the riot crashed, killing 2 police officers. The President of the United States made matters worse when he refused to condemn the violence. The escalation of racial tension led to white supremacist rallies across North America, including one here in Vancouver. So it begs the question, are we following the United States and becoming more racist? Former British Columbia Premier Ujjal Dosanjh says no, we are not. He points to the fact that racism has become presidential in the US, but not prime ministerial in Canada. We asked Mr. Dosanjh to join us for a conversation that matters about racism in Canada.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Mr. Dosanjh, welcome to Conversations That Matter.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. I've been watching the rise in racist rhetoric in the United States and start to wonder, okay, is it starting to leak into Canadian society? Are we a racist society? Are we tending that way right at the moment? Because if we look at Canadian history post the mid-1960s, we've moved in the opposite direction. Do we need to be on guard that we are becoming a less tolerant society at the moment?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think to say whether Canada is a racist society or not is a very huge question. I would rather talk about whether Canada has as much racism as it had 50 years ago.
And your answer?
My answer is it's much less.
Why do you think that is? What did we do?
Well, we've changed the laws, we've changed attitudes. We don't send kids to residential schools anymore. We don't discriminate people based on race, religion, ethnicity, in jobs.
Well, we don't do it legally, but we might do it privately.
Well, I'm talking in terms of the laws.
Yeah, okay.
But obviously, that continues to happen despite the laws in some cases, and but not as many cases as it did even 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even when the laws were being changed. So I think we are a much better society than we were. Rather than talking about whether we are a racist society, show me one that isn't in that sense.
It's probably a universal concept.
Well, I mean, racism is a universal problem. In every country, there's a problem. I come from India. You know, India is the most color-conscious country on earth. White is supposed to be superior, fairer skin, so-called. So, you know, is that racism? Of course, it is something. It's discrimination.
Your access to opportunity, your ability to get education and so on gets determined by things that are just there by virtue of your birth.
Absolutely. You had nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, I would change the question around. I don't think we should ask the question, are we a racist society? All societies are racist to some extent or the other. But we should ask the question, have we moved in the right direction? From the question about leaking from across the border, where in the U.S. you already have racism has become presidential, if I might say. But in Canada, it hasn't become prime ministerial.
No.
We're lucky. In fact, it's the opposite. Our prime minister stands up on these issues and does so fairly regularly and vocally.
Right. He has a very inclusive
absolutely.
view of life.
So I think that we as a society, I think in a sense he represents the difference between us and the U.S. Whereas in the U.S., the presidential race was for Mr. Trump. It was all about race, whether it was the Muslims, whether it was the blacks, whatever. It was all about race. He didn't say it so explicitly, but he said it otherwise explicit.
Racism, bigotry, prejudice, these things exist. What is our best approach, though, when we are confronted with that? When I see that, I go, okay, what do I do? How do I address this?
Well, I think that the best way to address it is to remain open to the other point of view. And what happens is sometimes we try and shout each other down rather than talk to each other. You're always going to have racists to contend with, just as you're going to have left-wingers and right-wingers in politics. You're always going to have people who are fairer towards each other and just, and the people who aren't, for many different reasons, including being racists.
But usually that kind of behavior exhibits itself in a moment when you're saying, well, I don't have the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with you about this right now, where we can say, if I take a look at your genome and my genome, we know that they're 99.99998% exactly the same. So let's, rather than worry about our insignificant differences, let's embrace our common humanity. I generally don't have that, especially when I encounter somebody who's going to say, "Well, I don't get that," or "I don't see life that way."
Well, I think partly it's because our inclusiveness actually stops at the skin. It's skin deep. Some of us say, like, if I'm brown and you're white, and I say to you, "You don't understand anything about being brown. You can't even talk to me about racism. You don't know what racism is." When we come to that, then we stop talking to each other. And that, in fact, is a challenge that we pride ourselves on democracy and freedom of expression, but we don't allow each other in these fundamental issues the real freedom to be and to express ourselves as freely and frankly as we can. And sometimes that conversation can go into insults and descend into abuse. Obviously, there's a place when we need to stop. But before abuse and before haranguing, we should be able to decently and politely talk to each other about the most difficult issues. And racism is a very difficult issue. One of the things I am concerned about is that about things like racism that actually touch our consciences, that are deep inside us. Sometimes we don't even realize we're not actually prepared to be civil to each other much of the time about that issue.
Give me an example.
Well, for instance, I was at the rally that Vancouver had, and you had people expressing outrage and genuine disgust over racism, and you also had examples of people shouting other people down and not allowing them to display what they wanted to display. If I have the right to be outraged about something that I dislike, other people have the same right to be outraged, even if the thing they're outraged about is right.
Okay.
That's called the freedom of expression.
Yes. Which is a right that's entrenched in the First Amendment in the United States. It doesn't apply here. But we adhere to that same concept. I'm allowed to tell you how I feel. But you're also allowed to tell me how you want to react.
Absolutely. And then sometimes we react wrongly. That's where, a civil discourse becomes uncivil. And obviously that's where the police comes in and separates us and we go our ways.
So
hopefully.
At that very rally, I got an email from a gentleman who is from the Middle East who was videotaping somebody who was saying that they were opposed to illegal immigration. And he wasn't saying opposed to immigration, but he was never given a chance to talk because he was shouted down. This person who videotaped this and sent it to me, it was interesting to watch him very, very calmly interact with people on both sides of this shouting match. He writes to me and said, "I don't think that anybody's winning here. The people who are shouting him down are actually creating a negative response. And what they're doing is that they're then starting to drive people like him underground. And when that happens, I think that we're in bigger trouble.
Well, I think we're already there, and that incident shows that we're there. If the chap is simply saying, I oppose illegal immigration. First of all,
why is he doing it there?
Well, no, but first of all, why is immigration always about race? That's a more fundamental question. Why is he at the rally when you have immigrants coming from all over the world? Vast numbers of them come from colored places, if I can use that term. So why is immigration always about racism? And when you have those two issues, then it's really, that it is the fear some people have developed, whether it's real or imagined, that the whole country is being invaded by people of color from all different cultures and backgrounds, and we're about to lose something that we've had for a long time. And it is that fear, and not necessarily rationality, that might bring some people to that kind of a rally against racism about what kind of immigration they like.
The events that have really moved me in my life were a combination of interesting things. I had the pleasure of watching Bill Clinton give a presentation here in Vancouver shortly after his presidency had come to its end. And he was talking about the fact that we live in an interconnected world. And we can't deny that, and that we have to embrace our common humanity and set aside our insignificant differences. And I, there's a part of me that goes, that is my philosophy. It really is. And then I watched the election of Barack Obama in the United States, and I thought, my gosh, look at how far we've come. Isn't this a fantastic world that I'm living in? And all of a sudden, here we are, 8-9 years later, and it's as though it's been an about face, and it causes me concern. And so I say, how then do we address this, that we can keep moving forward to, as Mr. Clinton put, embrace our common humanity?
Yeah, but you have to understand Obama or any changes that happen in Canada in the context they happen. Obama happened. And the moment he was elected, you had the rise of the Tea Party.
Well, the Tea Party was rising anyways, within the Republican Party before Obama.
But you had people within the next month or so standing up and saying, we want our country back. I'd never heard that right after a presidential election. That a large group of people would stand up and say, we want our country back, as if Obama had stolen the country. And so, in a sense, with all of the anxieties and problems and deprivations that some Americans have faced in the Rust Belt and other places in the country, Obama's capture of the presidency catapulted their resentment to the top. And that is what Trump rode into the presidency.
Yeah, he seemed to get that over everybody else.
Absolutely, because he tapped into it, and he obviously becomes a typical racist American in the way he talks.
Well, he's still doing it.
Well, he's thrown a nuclear bomb into the NFL.
What is the downside of shouting down people and shaming them if they express they're concerned about somebody else? What happens when we do that? So there are people who are lashing out at the President of the United States, but it also happens on a micro level in society. What happens then?
Well, if I believe what I'm saying is legitimate, and many of the racists genuinely believe that what they're saying is legitimate, no matter how distorted and convoluted and irrational it might be. If you attack them in a demeaning way, despite the fact that they're demeaning in the way they're talking, you are taking away their humanity. You're saying, whatever you're saying, I actually don't give a hoot. I don't want to hear you.
Right.
I don't want to talk to you. You're less than a human being. So if So if we are seeking respect from someone who is disrespecting me, for instance, if I'm seeking respect and equality,
Right.
then despite the fact, and I know some commentators say that this is what white society is like, that if the person that's attacked by racists is more moderate and more peaceful and inclusive, despite the attack, is a better person. I genuinely believe that the Gandhian philosophy works the best. If you want to change people's minds, then you have to say, you know what? Despite the fact that I find your views absolutely horrible, and you may be a horrible person, but I recognize the human being in you, I want to talk to you. You and I need to talk.
Right.
If we don't do that, and in debates on racism, that doesn't happen, you know that, I know that.
Well, because emotion is so...
Emotions take over, and the genuinely hurt get angry, and those that are already angry racists get angrier, and then you have Charlottesville.
Yes.
Right? And I think that we are on a very slippery slope. We need public leaders in politics and in other places to actually begin to say what democracy is, what freedom of expression is, what peaceful coexistence is, what living with differences means. Diversity is a strength, but diversity also means that there are going to be some racists who are going to remain racists.
Yes.
You're never going to have, hopefully we do, but I am of the view that for a long, long time, racism is here to stay. And if we don't find a way, a peaceful way, a less confrontational way of dealing with it, then we are in a very dangerous place.
Well, my feeling is that open dialogue, where I'm willing to say, even though I don't like what you're saying, as you say in that very Gandhi-esque manner, even though I don't like what you're saying, I want to understand why you're saying it, what motivates you, what could change your mind, how could you become more inclusive, how. That is, I think, the way forward. You're doing it actually in sunlight, which I think is the greatest disinfectant for racism.
Well, that doesn't happen, though.
For 10,000 reasons, and that's, I think, what makes it difficult.
It didn't happen at the rally in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Obviously, rally was well-meaning, and that demonstrator that you're talking about illegal immigrants was well-meaning, but that dialogue didn't happen. And that's why we need to we need to learn to kind of diffuse these situations and then begin to have a conversation, a discussion, a meaningful dialogue. In demonstrations and rallies, what one sees, and I'm not saying they shouldn't happen, I mean, demonstrations have changed the world. They are an important part of how we change society.
Yeah.
But I think racism is one issue where demonstrations are not going to work, because the enemy is us. And many of us, no matter who we are, in some nook and cranny of our cranial cavities resides some racism. And that is not to say we're all racist, but if we examine our conduct deeply, thoughtfully, and meaningfully, you will find that some action at some point in our lives was racist. And if we don't come to that conclusion about ourselves, we can't have a meaningful discussion. We are exclusionary in many ways. Like amongst the Indians, we use the term here, he is apna, like apna means ours. Like this guy is apna, which means he's brown, he's Indian, but the opposite of ours is the other. But we use that expression totally inadvertently, totally without being conscious of what that does. It creates otherness for the larger society, right? And so I think that we need to examine those things. And I was very conscious when I was a public leader, elected public leader, that I would go into minority communities and majority communities, and I was always talk about, particularly in the minority communities, about the indigenous nations of this country, how we've made a mess of their lives, how they need to have equality, fairness and justice and inclusion, and that we, as minorities who are cognizant of some of the issues that they face, but not as horribly as they are,
right.
We should be ensuring that when we talk about inclusion and equality, that we think of them.
I want to just end with something from Martin Luther King. He says, we can address racism, but it must happen in a holistic way. And to do that, you have to name it. You have to face it. And, if we're doing it in a holistic way, that means that we can't be yelling at one another. But we do have to denounce it. There's no way that we can move forward if we're saying that that is acceptable. We have to say, I accept somebody else as a fellow human being. And then I think if we have open discourse and we know that's where we want to go, we can start to dismantle it. We can pull it apart for what it is. And I think that if you can do that in a way that somebody can say, yes, but, and then you can have those discussions, you can help to move the dial a bit. And then he goes on to say, then we must work together to create a community that is whole, inclusive, just, and respects the rights of all residents.
It's a long struggle. He perished in it, and it's going to be with us for a long time. Denunciation can't supersede discussion.
Yes.
And it shouldn't prevent discussion. That's why discussion should be the foremost thing. In discussion and differing civilly, we're denouncing it.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that is the path.
If we do pure denunciation without discussion, it's futile.
Thank you very much. Let's keep talking about this. Thank you.